David's story begins in the most humble of ways, far from the grand palaces of kings. He was just a shepherd boy, the youngest son in his family, spending his days in the fields tending sheep. But God saw something in David that no one else could see, a heart that truly loved him. David wasn't perfect, but he had a deep trust in God, always turning to him in times of trouble. This is why he was called a man after God's own heart. What makes David's story so fascinating is that, despite being ordinary, he was chosen by God for an extraordinary purpose. It shows that no matter where you come from or what you do, God can have big plans for your life. David faced many struggles, made mistakes, and even committed great sins, but his faith in God always brought him back to the right path. His life is a powerful example of overcoming hardships through faith. One of the most captivating aspects of David's story is his relationship with God. It wasn't just about following rules, it was about love, trust, and repentance. David knew that even when he failed, God's mercy would always give him a second chance. This is why David's story resonates with so many people, because it reminds us that we don't have to be perfect to be loved by God. David's journey from shepherd to king is filled with lessons that we can apply to our own lives. He teaches us about courage, faith, and humility. Whether he was standing before the giant Goliath or hiding from King Saul's wrath, David always found his strength in God. His story is a reminder that we, too, can find strength in God during our darkest times. As we dive deeper into David's life, we'll uncover the battles he fought, the friendships he cherished, and the faith that guided him. It's a story of triumph and failure, joy and sorrow. But most importantly, it's a story of a man who never stopped seeking God's heart, ready to explore how David's journey truly begins. Let's look at how a simple shepherd was chosen by God for greatness. David's life as a shepherd seemed simple and uneventful. He spent his days watching over his father's sheep in the fields of Bethlehem. While his older brothers were out fighting in battles, David was left alone with the sheep, learning to defend them from wild animals like lions and bears. But what no one knew was that God was preparing him for something far greater. His time as a shepherd wasn't wasted. It was the perfect training for what would come next. One day, the prophet Samuel arrived at David's home. He had been sent by God to anoint a new king for Israel. Samuel asked David's father, Jesse, to bring all his sons before him. Jesse proudly showed his older, stronger sons, but none of them were chosen by God. Samuel was puzzled and asked if there was another son. Only then did Jesse mention David, the youngest, who was out in the fields tending the sheep. When David arrived, God told Samuel, "This is the one." Even though David was just a boy, God saw his heart and chose him to be the future king of Israel. Samuel anointed David with oil, a sign that God had chosen him for a special purpose. It was a moment that changed David's life forever, but he didn't become king right away. David returned to the fields, where he continued to look after the sheep, but now with the knowledge that God had great plans for him. This part of David's story teaches us that God doesn't look at outward appearances. He looks at the heart. David wasn't the tallest or the strongest, but his heart was filled with faith, courage, and love for God. This reminds us that we don't need to be the best or the brightest to be used by God. He can use anyone, no matter how ordinary they may seem, for extraordinary things. As David continued to care for the sheep, little did he know that his next challenge would be far bigger than lions or bears. Soon, David would be called to face a giant, a challenge that would test not just his strength, but his faith in God. Are you ready to discover how this young shepherd took on one of the greatest battles in history? David's encounter with Goliath is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. At this point, David was still a young shepherd, but his life was about to change dramatically. The Israelites were at war with the Philistines, and a giant warrior named Goliath challenged the army of Israel. Goliath was huge, nearly 10 feet tall, covered in armor and armed with a massive spear. Every day for 40 days, he mocked the Israelites, daring them to send someone to fight him. But no one was brave enough to face the giant. David's older brothers were in the army, so one day David went to bring them food. When he arrived at the battlefield, he heard Goliath's challenge. David was shocked that no one was willing to fight him. How could they allow this giant to mock the armies of the living God? Without hesitation, David offered to fight Goliath. Everyone laughed at him. How could a young shepherd defeat a seasoned warrior like Goliath? But David wasn't afraid. He had faced lions and bears while protecting his sheep, and he knew that God had protected him then and would protect him now. King Saul, the leader of Israel, allowed David to fight Goliath but offered him his own armor. The armor was too big and heavy for David, so he took it off. Instead, David chose 5 smooth stones from a stream and used his trusty sling. As he approached Goliath, the giant laughed at the sight of a young boy armed with only a sling. But David boldly declared, "You come to me with a sword, spear, and shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." With one swift motion, David slung a stone straight at Goliath's forehead. The stone hit its mark, and the giant fell to the ground. David then took Goliath's own sword and killed him. The Philistines, terrified by the sight of their champion being defeated by a boy, fled, and the Israelites won the battle. David's faith and courage had led to an incredible victory. David's battle with Goliath reminds us that no challenge is too big when we trust in God. Even when things seem impossible, faith in God can help us overcome the giants in our lives. With Goliath defeated, David's life was about to change forever. What would come next as he began to rise in power and influence? After David's victory over Goliath, he became well known throughout Israel. King Saul, impressed by David's courage, brought him into the royal court. It was there that David met Jonathan, Saul's son. Even though Jonathan was the heir to the throne, he didn't see David as a rival. Instead, Jonathan saw something special in David, his bravery, faith, and humility. They quickly became best friends, forming one of the most loyal and selfless friendships in the Bible. Jonathan admired David's heart for God and his courage in battle. In a powerful gesture of friendship, Jonathan gave David his royal robe, sword, and armor. This was a symbol of Jonathan's deep respect for David and his recognition of David's future as the next king of Israel. Jonathan didn't care about losing the throne. He only cared about doing what was right and supporting his friend. Have you ever had a friendship where both of you always supported each other, no matter what? As Saul's jealousy of David grew, Jonathan's loyalty to David was tested. Saul became so jealous that he wanted to kill David. Jonathan was heartbroken by his father's hatred, but he remained loyal to David. He warned David of his father's plans and helped him escape. Jonathan's love for David was so strong that he was willing to risk his own life to protect him. This friendship is a beautiful example of how true friends stick together, even in the hardest times. David and Jonathan's friendship was based on trust, loyalty, and a shared faith in God. They made a covenant to always protect and support each other. Jonathan even asked David to take care of his family if anything happened to him. This bond of friendship is one of the greatest examples in the Bible of love between friends. Jonathan was willing to sacrifice his own future as king for the sake of his friend, showing us that true friendship is about giving, not taking. Jonathan's loyalty and sacrifice left a lasting impact on David. Even after Jonathan's tragic death in battle, David never forgot his promise. He took care of Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, and treated him like his own family. The deep bond between David and Jonathan reminds us that true friendship is a gift from God, filled with love, trust, and sacrifice. Now that David had escaped Saul's jealousy, what challenges would he face next? David's fame spread across Israel. King Saul's jealousy grew stronger. The people praised David for his victory over Goliath, singing, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." This praise made Saul furious and filled his heart with envy. He began to see David as a threat to his throne. Saul's jealousy turned into hatred, and he became determined to get rid of David. Have you ever faced a situation where someone was jealous of your success? David had done nothing to harm Saul, yet Saul's anger towards him grew daily. Despite this, David continued to serve Saul faithfully. He played his harp to calm the king during his moments of distress, but Saul's jealousy was so strong that he even tried to kill David by throwing a spear at him. David narrowly escaped and fled for his life. It was a difficult time for David, but he trusted God to protect him. Saul's jealousy didn't stop there. He sent soldiers to capture David, but every time, David managed to escape with God's help. One of the most remarkable things about David during this period is that he never tried to harm Saul. Even though Saul was trying to kill him, David respected Saul as the king chosen by God. He believed that God's timing would decide when he would become king, not his own actions. This shows David's incredible faith and patience. David spent years on the run, hiding from Saul in caves, deserts, and even enemy territories. Yet through all the hardships, David continued to trust in God's plan for his life. He wrote many psalms during this time, expressing his fears, frustrations, and faith. One of his famous psalms, Psalm 23, reflects his deep trust in God as his shepherd, guiding and protecting him through the darkest valleys. Even though David was being hunted, he never lost hope in God's promises. His faith remained unshaken, and he continued to rely on God's guidance. How David managed to escape from Saul's relentless pursuit is a testimony to his unwavering trust in God. But what would happen when David had the chance to end Saul's life? Would he take it? Imagine being in a cave, hiding from someone trying to kill you, and then realizing they've entered the same cave, completely unaware of your presence. This was the situation David found himself in. Saul, hunting David, entered a cave to rest, not knowing that David and his men were hiding further inside. David's men saw this as a golden opportunity to finally end Saul's pursuit. They urged David to kill Saul, telling him that God had delivered his enemy into his hands. But David didn't see it that way. Despite everything Saul had done to him, David refused to harm the king. He knew that Saul was still the anointed king of Israel, chosen by God. Instead of taking Saul's life, David quietly cut off a piece of Saul's robe to prove how close he had been to ending Saul's life. After Saul left the cave, David called out to him, holding the piece of cloth as proof of his mercy. Saul was shocked when he realized how close he had been to death. David could have taken revenge, but instead he chose to show mercy. David told Saul, "I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed." This act of compassion revealed David's deep respect for God's will. He trusted that God would handle the situation in his own time. David's decision to spare Saul's life wasn't just about avoiding bloodshed, it was about showing obedience to God. Saul, moved by David's mercy, wept and admitted that David was more righteous than he was. He even acknowledged that David would one day be king. For a moment, there was peace between them, but Saul's jealousy soon returned. Despite this, David's act of mercy set a powerful example of how to trust in God's plan and resist the temptation to take matters into our own hands. David's faith and patience were remarkable. Even when given the chance to end his struggles, he chose to wait for God's timing. But this wasn't the only time David spared Saul's life. What would David do the next time he had the opportunity to kill his enemy? After sparing Saul's life, David had to keep fleeing for his safety. He found refuge in the Cave of Adalum, a remote and hidden place. But David wasn't alone for long. Word spread that David, the man chosen by God and anointed by the prophet Samuel, was hiding there. People from all over Israel began to seek him out. These weren't mighty warriors or influential leaders. They were men in distress, in debt, and discontented with life under King Saul's rule. It was in this cave, with a band of misfits, that David's leadership truly began to shine. David didn't turn these troubled men away. Instead, he welcomed them, listened to their stories, and gave them a sense of purpose. Slowly, this group of outcasts became a loyal and dedicated army, bound by their trust in David and their shared hope for a better future. David taught them not just how to fight, but how to live with courage and faith. David's ability to turn ordinary men into a cohesive force wasn't just about military strategy, it was about compassion and faith. He saw potential in each of them and helped them see it in themselves. He led them in more than just battle preparations, he led them spiritually. David often spoke of God's protection and how faith had guided him through his darkest moments. His words encouraged the men, reminding them that God could turn their lives around just as he was doing for David. The Cave of Adalum became more than a shelter. It was a place of transformation. The men who arrived there were discouraged and broken, but they left as courageous warriors. They believed in David's leadership, not because of his strength, but because of his unwavering faith in God. David's time in the cave proved that even in the darkest places, God can shape us into something greater. This ragtag army would become the foundation of David's future reign as king. The bonds they formed in the cave lasted a lifetime, and their loyalty to David never wavered. But as David's influence grew, so did the dangers around him. What would happen when Saul's reign came to an end? As David continued to flee from Saul, a great tragedy unfolded. Saul and his son Jonathan, David's dearest friend, were fighting against the Philistines. The battle took place on Mount Gilboa, where the Israelite army was severely overwhelmed. Saul, seeing the defeat and knowing his time was near, chose to fall on his own sword to avoid being captured. Jonathan, brave and loyal to the end, also lost his life that day. When the news of Saul and Jonathan's deaths reached David, his heart was broken. Even though Saul had pursued him relentlessly, David had always respected him as the Lord's anointed, and Jonathan, who had been like a brother to David, was gone. The grief was overwhelming, but David's response showed his deep character. He composed a song of lamentation, known as the Song of the Bow, to honor both Saul and Jonathan. David's lament wasn't filled with bitterness towards Saul. Instead, it expressed respect and sorrow for the fallen king and his son. He ordered that this song be taught throughout Israel, ensuring that their memory would be honored. This showed David's great sense of loyalty, not just to his friend Jonathan, but also to Saul, despite their troubled history. David recognized that, in their own ways, they had both been crucial to Israel's story. With Saul's death, Israel was left without a king, and there was confusion and uncertainty about who would lead. Many in Judah, the tribe David belonged to, knew that he had been chosen by God to be king. David returned to Hebron, where the leaders of Judah came together and anointed him as their king. But David's journey to become king of all Israel was far from over. Though he was now king of Judah, the northern tribes remained loyal to Saul's remaining son, Ishbosheth. This created tension and a period of rivalry between the house of Saul and the house of David. But David, wise and patient, didn't rush to claim the entire kingdom by force. Instead, he trusted in God's timing and plan, knowing that the throne of Israel would come to him in due course. After years of division between the northern tribes and Judah, the time finally came for David to unite the entire nation. The turning point came when Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, was murdered by his own men. Though his death could have paved the way for David's swift rise to power, David was furious with the assassins. He had them punished, showing that he would not tolerate treachery even when it seemed to benefit him. This act of justice impressed the leaders of Israel. They realized that David wasn't just a powerful warrior, but a man of integrity. So they gathered in Hebron and anointed him as the king of all Israel. At last, the nation was united under David's leadership, and the kingdom of Israel entered a new era of peace and prosperity. David had waited patiently, trusting in God's plan, and now the throne was his. David's first move as king of a united Israel was to establish a new capital. He chose Jerusalem, a neutral city, neither belonging to the north nor the south, symbolizing the unity of all the tribes. Jerusalem would become the political and spiritual heart of Israel. David's decision to make this city the center of his reign showed his wisdom in bringing the people together. With the kingdom united, David's military victories continued. He expanded Israel's territory, secured its borders, and defeated its enemies. But David wasn't just a military leader, he was a man of deep faith. He ruled with justice and mercy, always seeking God's guidance. His leadership brought stability to Israel, and the people flourished under his reign. David's rise to power wasn't just about gaining a throne. It was about fulfilling God's promise and showing that true leadership comes from faith, integrity, and patience. What would David do next to strengthen the nation? David's reign was marked by many great achievements, but one of his most significant was bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark symbolized God's presence with his people, and David wanted to make sure it was at the heart of the nation's capital. This event wasn't just a political move, it was a deeply spiritual one, showing David's devotion to God. The journey to bring the Ark to Jerusalem was filled with celebration. David gathered thousands of people to witness the event. Musicians played, people sang, and there was a sense of joy throughout the land. David himself led the procession, dancing with all his might before the Lord, showing that even as a king, he remained humble and deeply connected to God. However, the journey was not without challenges. At one point, one of the men carrying the ark, Uzzah, touched it to steady it and was struck down by God. This moment reminded everyone of the ark's holiness and the seriousness of handling it properly. David, initially fearful, paused the journey and left the ark at the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. During this time, Obed-Edom's household was blessed, confirming to David that God's favor was still upon the ark. When the ark finally arrived in Jerusalem, the celebration continued. David offered sacrifices to the Lord and blessed the people. He even distributed food to everyone present, making sure that the joy was shared by all. This event marked a turning point in Israel's history, as Jerusalem became not just the political capital, but the spiritual center of the nation. David's wife, Michal, however, didn't share in the celebration. She criticized David for dancing before the Lord, but David defended his actions, saying that he would continue to humble himself before God. This moment highlighted the contrast between David's devotion to God and Michal's concern with appearances. David's love for God was genuine, and he wasn't afraid to show it, no matter what others thought. David was a man after God's own heart, but even great men fall. One of the most challenging parts of David's life came when he made a terrible mistake involving a woman named Bathsheba. It was a time when kings were supposed to be at war, but David stayed behind in Jerusalem. One evening, from his palace rooftop, he saw Bathsheba bathing. Overcome with desire, he sent for her, even though she was married to Uriah, one of his loyal soldiers. David and Bathsheba's encounter led to her becoming pregnant, which put David in a difficult position. To cover his tracks, David brought Uriah back from the battlefield, hoping he would go home to his wife. But Uriah, being honorable, refused to leave his fellow soldiers behind. David's plan failed, and in desperation, he made a terrible decision. He ordered Uriah to be sent to the front lines of battle, where he would surely die. After Uriah's death, David took Bathsheba as his wife. It seemed like he had successfully hidden his sin from the world. But nothing is hidden from God. God sent the prophet Nathan to confront David. Nathan told a story about a rich man who took a poor man's only lamb. When David heard the story, he was furious, saying the rich man deserved to be punished. Then Nathan looked at David and said, "You are that man." David realized the weight of his sin and was deeply grieved. He confessed his wrongdoing and sought God's forgiveness. Psalm 51, one of the most heartfelt prayers of repentance, was born out of this moment. David cried out for mercy, asking God to cleanse him and create a pure heart within him. He knew he had wronged not just Bathsheba and Uriah, but God himself. Though God forgave David, there were still consequences. The child born from David's sin died, and his family faced turmoil in the years that followed. Yet through his repentance, David remained close to God, showing us that no one is beyond redemption if they genuinely seek forgiveness. David's later years were marked by wisdom, leadership, and a deepened faith in God. After repenting from his sin with Bathsheba, David continued to reign as a king, but he never forgot the lessons he had learned. He was determined to leave a lasting legacy for Israel, and one of his greatest desires was to build a temple for God. However, God told David that this task would be passed on to his son, Solomon. Instead of feeling disappointed, David prepared everything so Solomon could succeed. David gathered materials, made plans, and organized the workers for the future temple. He wanted the house of God to reflect his glory and be a place where his people could come to worship. David's vision for the temple showed his deep devotion to God and his understanding of the importance of worship. He may not have seen the temple built in his lifetime, but his preparations laid the foundation for its construction. As David's reign drew to a close, he called for his son Solomon and gave him advice that would shape his future. He told Solomon to follow God with all his heart, obeying his commandments and trusting in his wisdom. David knew that Israel's future depended on Solomon's faithfulness to God's law. He also encouraged Solomon to be strong and courageous in building the temple, reminding him that God would be with him in every step. David, often called a man after God's own heart, always placed his relationship with God at the center of his life. Despite his many victories and accomplishments, David's greatest strength was his faith. He wasn't perfect, but he constantly sought God's guidance, even in his failures. Through the Psalms, David left behind not only a physical legacy, but also a spiritual one. His prayers and songs continue to inspire people to trust in God's grace and mercy. David passed away after ruling for 40 years, leaving behind a united Israel, a prepared temple project, and a spiritual legacy that would endure for generations. His life, full of triumphs, mistakes, and heartfelt repentance, teaches us that even in our weaknesses, God's strength can shine through. David's story reminds us that God values a heart that seeks after him, and his legacy continues to inspire faith and devotion. If you found this story inspiring, leave your comments below and share your thoughts about the legacy of King David, the man after God's own heart. We'd love to hear how his journey resonates with your own. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming stories and lessons from the Bible. Join us as we continue exploring the incredible faith and wisdom found in these timeless stories.